and focus. It is entirely prophecy, where the Lord is giving visions and dreams to Daniel about what was to be in the future for the nation of Israel and for the world. It's very interesting what God chooses to lay out in terms of the future to Daniel. In this chapter, he's going to spend a tremendous amount of time dealing with a man by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes. And you look at him and you say, who is this guy compared to so many others that the Lord could have told us about as it relates to man's history? But God looks at man's history differently from the way that man does. What is most important to him in man's history, most significant to him, is man's history that has to do with his people. How his people are treated, how the Jews were treated in the Old Testament, and how his church is handled and treated in the New Testament. So what may seem to be obscure to historians is very important to God, because he never takes his eyes off of his people on this planet. And so, in chapter 8, God continues his series of visions here, giving Daniel vision into man's future all the way down to the end when God is going to bring man's rebellious rule to an end and he's going to establish his own kingdom. The vision of chapter 7, verses 1 through 14 corresponded with the vision that was in Daniel chapter 2, dealing with this 4 successive world-ruling empires that were going to appear as a part of man's history. The vision that he gives to Daniel here in chapter 8 focuses on the middle 2 of those empires. He spoke about the Babylonian Empire, Mito-Persian Empire, the Grecian Empire, and then the Roman Empire. And now he's going to pull the two middle empires out, and he's going to put that a little further under the microscope for Daniel in this 8th chapter of Daniel. Now remember, as we get into this, and let's read the first verse here. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one that appeared to me the first time. Speaking of the vision or the dream that he received in chapter 7. In these first vision that was given to him there in chapter 7, it was given to him, you notice in verse 1, in the 1st year of Belshazzar's reign. The second vision is given him into the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar. So a 2-year period has gone by. Might have taken Daniel 2 years to recover from the vision. It really had a physical impact upon him. And so this is what is being focused on now in the timing of it. The vision in chapter 8 was given to Daniel by God in 551 BC. If that's not in your margin, that's a good thing to put in your margin. 551 BC was 14 years before the establishment of the Mito-Persian Empire. And God is going to speak here about the defeat of the Mito-Persian, the fact that the Mito-Persians are going to follow the Babylonian Empire, but God not only looks to the Mito-Persian Empire that was coming, but he looks even beyond it to the Grecian Empire that was going to defeat the Mito-Persians. And so here he is, he's talking about the establishment of the Mito-Persian Empire 14 years before it ever happened, before the defeat of the city of Babylon. Now, as it relates to all of this, we look back on it, it's history for us. We say, well, of course, the Babylonians fell to the Mito-Persians, and the Mito-Persians fell to the Greeks, and the Greeks fell to the Romans. I mean, that's history, but it wasn't history for Daniel. If you would have told Daniel 14 years before Babylon fell to the Mito-Persians, or if Daniel had taken and given that news to the people of Babylon, they would have laughed in his face. They didn't even believe that the city of Babylon could fall on the night that it fell, much less believe that it was going to fall 14 years before it did. And yet God declared that it would happen, and it happened exactly as God declared that it would. This prophecy that was given during Babylon's reign to Daniel was given to Daniel 217 years before the first great battle between two world-ruling empires known as the Mito-Persians and the Grecians. When Alexander the Great came against the Mito-Persian Empire and defeated it, all of which is prophesied in this chapter, we will get to it. But that was given 217 years prior to the event. God again, and only God, is able to declare these things in that kind of a way. No one is able to give that kind of prophecy with that kind of accuracy, and it's a testimony to the inspiration of the Scriptures. This prophecy, also in chapter 8, speaks of the death of Alexander the Great, and this prophecy is given 228 years before the death of Alexander the Great occurred. This chapter also speaks of the rise and the fall of a man by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes, who was one of the rulers of the broken up Grecian Empire. And God speaks of Antiochus Epiphanes to Daniel at this time, 387 years before Antiochus Epiphanes ever appeared on the scene. So again, we look back and we say, oh yes, it all fell in place neatly. And we can sometimes miss how astonishing that God would give that kind of prophecy to Daniel, and how perfectly it was fulfilled just as God knew that it would happen. And so we have this vision occurring in chapter 8, 551 BC. And he receives this vision in verse 2. I saw the vision, and it so happened while I was looking that I was in Shushan. So he's receiving a vision. It's not a dream. A dream is different from a vision. A vision is different from a dream. A vision is something where you see this picture, what God is showing you, kind of like a movie in your head, and before your eyes, only you're not asleep. A dream is of any significance is that God gives is something that happens while you're asleep. He's awake. He receives a vision. It so happened while he was looking and receives this vision that I was in Shushan in the citadel, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in the vision that I was by the river Ulai. And so the indication here in verse 2 is that he's not, that he is seeing himself in the palace of Shushan. Now, the reason that he's going to receive this vision by God in the area of Shushan is that nobody else knows but God that this is going to be the headquarters or the capital city of the Persians. So where better to give Daniel a prophecy concerning the rise of this empire than to take him by vision right into the city that's going to become their capital. Some people believe that he was taken there, God taking him there physically by a miraculous means, or that he was stationed there by Belshazzar, and he was there as an ambassador and then received the vision while he was there as an ambassador. It seems more likely in the wording of the verse that he received the vision. He was there in Babylon, and all of a sudden he sees himself in the city of Shushan, and there he is in the citadel, which was kind of the palace for kings. It was really more of a fortress. And so this is the location and the timing of the vision. And then Daniel said in verse 3, I lifted up my eyes, and I saw, and there, standing beside the river, was a ram which had two horns. And so he's seeing this vision, and the thing that he sees is this ram. And he notices the two horns on the ram, because the two horns were high, but one was higher than the other. And the higher one came up last. So he's watching this ram. This ram has two huge horns, the kind of ram that Don Loudermilk would like to shoot. But anyway, that's a whole other story. But anyway, he's got these two huge horns, and one of the horns is bigger in size than the other horn, and the larger horn, as he sees the vision, came up later than the earlier horn. In the ancient times, the ram was a symbol of the Medo-Persian Empire, and certainly of the Persian Empire. In fact, when the king of the Persian Empire would go out to meet his troops, He wouldn't wear a diadem. He wouldn't wear a crown or anything like that. He would wear a golden ram's head. That's what he would wear out there. And so beats a real one. But that's what he would wear out there, this golden ram's head. And all through the excavations of that empire, the ram was used in the colonnades and all as a symbol of Persia, and he would have understood it to be such. And the Medo-Persian Empire was interesting. You have the two horns representing the Medes and the Persians. The interesting thing is that it was the Medes that principally defeated the Babylonians, but following the defeat of the Babylonians, the alliance with the Persians, and the Persians became a greater people than the Medes. So you had an alliance, but it was an unequal alliance. One horn was greater than the other horn, and it was the horn that joined later that became the greater. And all of that, we know historically, looking back, was true of the Medo-Persian Empire, just as God had spoken of it here 14 years before it ever came to pass. And he's watching this ram, and verse 4, and the ram was pushing westward and northward and southward, so that no beast could withstand him, nor was there any that could deliver from his hand, but he did according to his will and became great. We're talking about a world-ruling empire. The Medo-Persians did exactly what they wanted because nobody could say anything to them. They were the bully on the block at that time in man's history. Interesting, we're told the Lord tells Daniel here that this ram, when it comes on the scene, it's going to extend its kingdom to the west, to the north, and to the south. Omission of the east. Fascinating that when the Medo-Persian Empire was established, it did not expand its kingdom significantly to the east, but expanded its kingdom in the other three directions, again, as God had prophesied here through this vision that he gave. And so you have this ram pushing in all of these directions, and the north, the south, and the westward direction. It corresponds to the vision of the last chapter, speaking of the Medo-Persian Empire as a bear with the three ribs in its mouth, representing the three areas of conquest of that empire. And here, the ram, the same thing being communicated. It would extend extensively westward, northward, and southward. I mean, this is one of the things you have to do as it relates to all of this, and all of us, we grow in this whole prophetic element as it relates to the Word of God. But take in what you can. And then the next time you learn a little more. The next time you get a book and learn a little bit more. But I mean, isn't the Lord's Word fascinating as He lays this thing out, and then to such a T, all of it so perfectly fulfilled? Well, I get a little excited about it. So in verse 5, he's talked about the ram now, and then God moves and brings another figure into Daniel's vision. And as I was considering, he's trying to get his bearings concerning this ram, suddenly, and that suddenly is an important word, suddenly a male goat came from the west across the surface of the earth without touching the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between its eyes. So he's looking at this ram, got these two unequal horns and the whole thing. One came up later. He looks over here, and all of a sudden there's this big goat coming out of the west, and it's moving very, very swiftly, so swiftly that it doesn't touch the ground. And it has a single notable horn, one great horn. The interesting thing is in the Scriptures, the horn most often speaks of power. And so when the horn is spoken of, it's speaking about the power. So you have this goat coming out of the west, has this great horn, and whatever that horn is, it has tremendous power. Now he's not going to leave this as a secret for any of us. Peek ahead there in verse 20. The angel Gabriel interprets the whole thing for us when he said, "The ram which you saw, Daniel," verse 20, "having the two horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia." And then in verse 21, "And the male goat is the kingdom of Greece, and the large horn that is between its eyes is the first king of the kingdom of Greece." And so this isn't something you have to read into. God gives the interpretation of it as very, very clear. And so you have this ram One of the chief characteristics of the Grecian Empire was it conquered the world at a staggeringly swift for warfare in those days, and that was what characterized it. It wasn't, the Grecians didn't have a huge army, but boy, they were a disciplined army. And when they took on the Mito-Persian Empire, it took 10 Mito-Persians to every Greek soldier. The Greek soldiers were disciplined. They had tactics in their warfare. Again, the Mito-Persians were like this lumbering bear. They just threw human bodies into the battle. And so this male goat, the Grecian Empire moved very, very quickly. Notice that this goat was going to come from the west, and of course, Greece was and is to the west of where the Mito-Persian Empire was located, and it came quickly, had the notable horn between its eyes, speaking of Alexander the Great. And then he came to the ram, so you've got to the ram that had two horns, which I saw standing beside the river, and ran at him with furious power. So what God is telling us here is that this goat coming out of the west is going to come after the Mito-Persians. It's not going to be, is going to come, and you've got this ram coming in one direction, you've got this goat coming in the other direction, and you ever see those television shows, the Discovery Channel, and when those guys hit, I mean, it's just an explosion when it hits, and these two are coming at full strength at one another, and they're going to hit one another with their armies. And so they come at him with verse 6, the ram is, or the goat is coming with furious power, and I saw him, verse 7, confronting the ram. He was moved with rage against him. He attacked the ram, broke his two horns, in other words, defeated the Mito-Persians, and there was no power in the ram to withstand him, but he cast him to the ground, trampled on him, and there was no one that could deliver the ram from his hand. And that is exactly what happened in history. There were three principal battles between the Greeks and the Mito-Persians, and the Greeks soundly defeated the Mito-Persians all three times, ultimately breaking their power completely. And what the Greeks did to the Mito-Persians is they just stomped them into the ground. And the reason that they did that, and you see this, you see the goat coming with great speed, furious power. I mean, the goat is angry. I mean, it's got revenge on its mind. And the Greeks did have revenge on their mind, and Alexander had revenge on his mind against the Mito-Persians for the time when the Mito-Persians attacked the Greeks earlier in their history. Alexander the Great said, I'm going to make an example of them, and he thrashed them to pieces, just as history has recorded, and God spoke to us here in His Word. And then in verse 8, therefore the male goat grew very great, but when he became strong, the large horn was broken, and in place of it 4 notable ones came up toward the 4 winds of heaven. So you have this male goat, the horn representing Alexander the Great, and when he became strong, at the height of his strength, God said that horn is going to be broken, that king is going to be broken. Alexander the Great died just short of his 33rd birthday. He became a general in the Grecian army at 21 years of age. He conquered the known world by the time he was 26. He became bored because he was a conqueror and not an administrator. He became bored because there was no more of the world to conquer. Tradition tells us that he wept over the fact that there weren't more armies, to conquer. And then in that bored condition, in state that he was in, he got himself involved in a party, got himself drunk, and drunkenness became a characteristic of his life in those days. Went out in a storm, in that drunken condition, and as we saw last week, he picked up, it appears, pneumonia, something like that, and died as a result of it. Alexander the Great was one of the most astounding conquerors in the history of the world. The guy would not stop. You grab a world map, and they didn't have big jets or anything like that. That guy conquered the world westward all the way into India. He conquered that section of the Middle East. He went through that whole part of that world all the way into Asia and supplied an army all the way that distance. He built Greek cities all the way along because he intended to have a means of communication between him and Athens all the way into the area of India and to export the Grecian culture. One of the fascinating things about the Roman Empire is that the Roman Empire borrowed almost completely from Grecian culture. It was a fabulous culture in their eyes, and just borrowed it and then did some adapting on it, gave their names to the gods, and built upon what Alexander the Great had done. But at the height of his strength, you notice God is telling Daniel he's not going to be defeated by another empire. His horn is going to be broken. And in the place of it, 4 notable horns are going to come up toward the 4 winds of heaven. And as we saw last week, when Alexander the Great died, the Grecian Empire, after a period of turmoil, was divided up among the 4 great generals of Alexander the Great, and each one of them ruled a section of the kingdom, just as God had spoken of here in this prophecy. Just astounding. Hundreds of years before it happened, he let Daniel know. And out of one of these 4 sections of the Grecian Empire, he says, out of one of them came a little horn which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. And so now you've got a little horn, one of these 4 horns, and it comes on the scene, and now it has the attention of God and the attention also of Daniel here as God prophesies to him concerning this. The little horn is identified historically as Antiochus Epiphanes. He grows out of one of those 4 horns. You notice that the little horn is not the same as the horn described in Daniel chapter 7. In Daniel chapter 7, the horn that comes up among those other horns in Daniel chapter 7 have to do with the 4th kingdom, the Roman Empire. And this is a little horn rising up out of the 3rd kingdom, and as it relates to the Grecian Empire. In 175 BC, it's a good date to know, a man by the name of this Antiochus Epiphanes came into power. He ruled for about 12 years. He was the 8th king of the Seleucid, or the Syrian dynasty. One of the 4 sections that the Grecian Empire was broken into was a Syrian section, and Antiochus Epiphanes was a part of the lineage of the rulers that was over that section, and he emerged within that part of the dynasty. His name, in his birth name, was Antiochus IV. He added the name Epiphanes to his name when he began to reign, and his title that he took to himself was Theos Antiochus Epiphanes, which means the illustrious God. So we already know we got trouble with this guy. He thinks he's God. And he's kind of a type of one who's going to come on the scene in the last days, who's going to think he's God also, and that is another little horn, the Antichrist, in the last days. So his name means the illustrious God. And you notice in verse 9 that immediately he starts to take military actions. They're directed towards the south. He directs himself toward the east, and then toward the glorious land, which is Israel. Antiochus Epiphanes was an anti-Semite to the core. He is one of the worst persecutors of the Jews in a very long history of persecution. When he took the throne, the first thing that he wanted to do was to expand his kingdom. And so he decided that he would enlarge his kingdom down into Israel. And so he took the land of Israel and he took Jerusalem. The problem is that brought him into conflict with the Egyptians, who like to think that Israel was theirs. And so the Egyptians came out to come against Antiochus Epiphanes as it relates to his, pioneering spirit in his conquests. And while he was in Jerusalem, Antiochus Epiphanes replaced the high priest with a man of his own choosing. He didn't want the high priest that was there. The trouble is that only God gets to choose the high priest, according to the law. Antiochus Epiphanes comes on the scene. He thinks nothing of saying, listen, I don't like you. I'm going to set up my own high priest, contrary to God's law. Antiochus Epiphanes then invaded Egypt. And in that invasion of Egypt, a rumor came back to Jerusalem that he had been killed in battle. The Jews, of course, were tremendously excited about that news, and believing it to be true, they reinstated the former high priest, the genuine high priest. Antiochus Epiphanes was not killed in the battle, and when he came back to Jerusalem and discovered that they had undone what he had done. Now listen, when you think you're God, you get a little testy about this stuff. And so they had taken and moved out the high priest that he had set up, put the one in that he had kicked out, and that really got him upset. And he accused the people, the Jews, of rebellion against him. And once again, he savagely attacked Jerusalem, and he executed tens of thousands of Jews there in the city. He killed 40,000 within the space of 3 days. And this isn't dropping bombs. It isn't a neat little clean way, so to speak, as modern warfare. He sent his troops in, and they hacked 40,000 Jews to pieces and then took others captive. Well, he wasn't done with that. To give you an idea of what this guy was all about, he then sacrificed a pig, which is unclean according to the law. He sacrificed a pig on the altar of burnt offering. And you read, that Old Testament, how sanctified all of this was unto the Lord. There wasn't even to be a lamb without spot, with spot or blemish to be offered there, much less an unclean animal. And he knew it, and he knew how to attack the religious beliefs of the Jews. And so he takes the most unclean animal that he knew of, took the pig, and he slaughtered the pig as a burnt offering. And then, not sufficient with that, he then took the pig's broth and he scattered it over the entire area of the temple. And then, not satisfied with that, he proceeded to go straight into the Holy of Holies, the place that represented the very presence of God, the place that only the high priest could go into, and then only once a year on the Day of Atonement, and only after having offered a sacrifice for his sin. And this Antiochus Epiphanes just blows right in there and goes into the Holy of Holies. Well, he's a picture of another horn in the future that is going to set himself up there in the temple during the Great Tribulation, the Antichrist, and he's going to present himself as God and defile the newly rebuilt temple during the Great Tribulation period. But this is what he did. And then in 168 BC, Antiochus Epiphanes tried to take Egypt again. He was foiled in his attempt, and as he was prone to do, he took out his anger upon the Jews, and more than 20,000 of his soldiers massacred the Jews that were gathered together to celebrate the Sabbath there in Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And it's estimated that in one of his rampages against the Jews, he killed 100,000 Jews. Then he stopped all of the daily sacrifices. And what he did in doing that was not only to rob the people of offering their sacrifices, but he was robbing God of his worship. He stopped the daily sacrifices. He forbid any circumcision of a Jewish male. The Sabbath and all of the other feast days he called off. He profaned them. He then took a statue of Zeus and set the statue up in the area of the temple. Again, a precursor to the Antichrist that is going to set himself up to be worshipped in the Great Tribulation This is the first abomination that causes desolation. The Antichrist will be the second one. And then he went so far as to begin to offer human sacrifices on the altars in the area of the temple. Outrageous. I mean, this kind of guy has demon-possessed. And how many of the great persecutors against the Jews and God's people have been in that kind of a category. And it was in this context, after Antiochus Epiphanes had done this, that Judas Maccabeus, one of the priests of Israel, rose up with the Jews in a revolt against Antiochus Epiphanes and his forces, and he defeated them. And following that defeat, they cleansed the temple, successful in their rebellion against this just, worst kind of human being. Antiochus Epiphanes ultimately died. He died of a disease, apparently, that he picked up somewhere, died in Persia of what is described as an extremely painful disease. And so, this gives you the background so that we can move more quickly through what describes it. In verse 9, out of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great, once again, toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. And again, God's prophecies, so perfect and detailed. And it grew up to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and some of the stars to the ground and trampled them. And so this horn grew up to the host of heaven. In other words, this guy wasn't just taking on God's people, he was going to take on God himself. And so you have the illustrious God for his name. And when you believe that about yourself, you get kind of arrogant. It tells us that this horn cast down some of the host, probably a reference to the high priest that was removed out of his post, and so many of the religious leaders of the Jews who were killed by Antiochus Epiphanes. And some of the stars, he put some of them to the ground and trampled them. The stars, probably a reference to the Jewish people as a whole. You remember when God was speaking concerning the future of Abraham in the book of Genesis. He took Abraham outside and he said, look up into the heavens. You see those stars? So shall your descendants be. And so often the stars are a picture of the descendants of Abraham, and it would fit the picture because he persecuted the Jews to such a degree. And he even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host. And by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. And so he exalts himself higher than God, as we see by the name that he gave himself. We know historically he took away the daily sacrifices that God had prophesied, and then the place of the sanctuary was cast down. What happened when Judas Maccabeus defeated Antiochus Epiphanes? They went in and completely cleansed the temple and rebuilt entirely the altar where these atrocities had happened. And so they had undid the damage that he had done there. Because of transgression, an army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifices. Again, he took those away. He cast truth down to the ground. He just maliciously made up as many laws as he could that violated the law of Moses. And so the truth of the Scriptures, he tried to cast it to the ground. By the way, the Word of God outlived him. And he did all this and prospered. And so he got away with it for a time. And, it looked like he was going to get away with it, but he only got away with it for a time. But for a while he did prosper. And then Daniel said, I heard a holy one speaking, probably an angel. And another holy one said to that certain one who was speaking. So you have a conversation now among the angels. And they said one to another, how long will the vision be concerning the daily sacrifices and the transgression of desolation? So here you have a picture of the abomination that causes desolation, kind of a shadow of it in Antiochus Epiphanes, the fullness of it in the Antichrist, which we'll talk about in some detail next week. The giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot. In other words, these two guys are looking at this whole scene, and they ask one another, how long is this going to go on? And then he said to me, 2,300 days, then the sanctuary shall be cleansed. It's interesting that God tells Daniel, by way of this vision, that this abomination of Antiochus Epiphanes is going to last for 2,300 days. That's a period between 6 and 7 years, and that corresponds to the length of his reign. From 171 BC, when Antiochus Epiphanes removed the legitimate high priest, and not only removed him, but murdered him, and then replaced that high priest with a false one, until Antiochus' death in 164 BC was 2,300 days. Fascinating, again, the insight of the Word of God. And so this intense persecution, it lasted for between 6 and 7 years, just as God had said. So verse 15, now it happened when I, Daniel, had seen the vision and was seeking the meaning, that suddenly there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of this place, who called and said, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. Whoa, wait a second. So we got Gabriel the Angel here. That's my twin brother's name, Gabriel. He was no angel. But anyway, he was a tease is what he was. But anyway, Gabriel comes on the scene. Fascinating that it is the first mention of an angel by name in the Bible, is here in this passage. Fascinating as it relates to the entirety of the Bible, only 3 angels are ever mentioned or identified by name. You have Gabriel, Michael, and of course Lucifer, Satan, the devil. And so here is Gabriel called upon to give Daniel the understanding of the vision. And so he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was afraid, and I fell on my face. But he said to me, understand, Son of Man, that the vision refers to the time of the end. And now as he was speaking, I want you to notice at the end of verse 17, that phrase, the time of the end. Now as he was speaking with me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground. So it's like he almost passes out here at the sight of an angel coming at him. So you better have your medical coverage up to date. You're going to want an angel to come in your room. But anyway, so he comes and he touched Daniel, and then he stood Daniel upright. And he said, look, I'm making known to you what shall happen in the latter time of the indignation. I'm not going to kill you. I'm going to let you know what's going to happen. For at the appointed time, the end shall be. The ram which you saw, having the 2 horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia. And the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. The large horn that is between its eyes is the first king. For as for the broken horn, the 4 that stood up in its place, 4 kingdoms shall arise out of that nation, but not with its power. And so they share the power of Alexander the Great. And so here is the interpretation that he gives of the dream. And then he says in verse 23, in the latter time of their kingdom, speaking of the Grecian Empire, when the transgressors have reached their fullness, a king shall arise. And now he's giving the interpretation of that little horn concerning Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, here's where we take a break for a moment. Would somebody just come up and sing a song here for a moment, just to hold on the screen? Bring the ice cream in. I'd like everyone to have a cup of ice cream, if we may. In this verses 23 through 26, he is going to give us an understanding, very in-depth understanding of Antiochus Epiphanes, that little horn that came to the surface. But he prefaces his teaching on that by telling us at the end of verse 17, at the end of verse 19, that this not only has to do with the Grecian Empire, but it also has to do with the end of man's history, the end times. In other words, what he is going to describe here concerning Antiochus Epiphanes is a shadow of one who's going to follow him with the same characteristics, that is going to pull these same kind of shenanigans at the end of time, when God is going to bring man's history to an end. And that's none other than the Antichrist. And so you have the parallels, a near fulfillment concerning Antiochus Epiphanes, a far fulfillment as it relates to the Antichrist. And so he describes this king in verse 23, and he describes this king as having fierce features. And so that's an interesting description for someone. But he'll have fierce features, or a fierce countenance. Have you ever, you have in the book of Proverbs, chapter 7, verse 13, it talks about the same word for fierce. It means bold. It's used for a harlot who's brazen, who's shameless. Have you ever talked with someone about the Lord, and when you do that, their very face changes? It contorts under the influence of that subject. And that's kind of what you've got here. A guy so given over to evil that his face, his features are affected by it. Notice he's described as one who will understand sinister schemes. That's what he's going to be about. He loves evil. There's a tendency to think, that most people only do evil kind of against their better judgment. That's not the way everyone is. That's not the way Antiochus Epiphanes was, and it's not the way the Antichrist is going to be. They love evil. There are people who love evil. That's what they love. It's not a mistake when they do it. They're hooked on it. They love to do it, and was a characteristic of him and will be of the Antichrist. His power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. Concerning Antiochus Epiphanes, his power was mighty, but it wasn't his power. It was a power that he received from Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great did all of the hard work. He just received it. In the last days, the Antichrist is going to have great power, but it's not going to be his power. It's going to be power the devil gives to him, because he's going to be possessed by the devil himself. Interesting, the parallels near and far. He shall destroy fearfully, and both of these men were and are going to be tremendous destroyers, and shall prosper and thrive. For a while in both of their lives, it looked like crime paid, but Antiochus Epiphanes, of course, ultimately died, and at the end of the 3.5 years of the great tribulation, the Antichrist is going to be brought down also. So he'll only thrive for a while. He shall destroy the mighty and also the holy people, which Antiochus Epiphanes did. The Antichrist during the Great Tribulation, he will target the Jews who have come to know the Lord, and all who've come to know the Lord during the Great Tribulation. And so they will go after God's holy people. And through his cunning, he shall cause deceit to prosper under his hand. And so that's what his kingdom is going to be all about. Deceit and lies are going to prosper under his reign. It's going to be what he uses to reign. You imagine that. And he shall magnify himself in his heart. He's going to be full of himself and only concerned about himself. Maybe his legacy, I don't know. But he's only concerned about himself, and he shall destroy many in their prosperity. The Jews were living at peace, and this guy came in and destroyed them in their prosperity. During the Great Tribulation, the Antichrist is going to make a covenant with the Jews, as we'll see next week, and they will be living in peace. And then all of a sudden, in 1 nanosecond, when he, at the middle point of the Great Tribulation, goes in to the temple, sets himself up as God, to be worshipped as God. Jesus said, when you see the abomination that causes desolation that Daniel the prophet spoke of, don't even grab a jacket out of your house. Get out of Jerusalem. Run for your life. And so all the way up to that moment, they thought they had peace until these guys revealed their true colors. And he shall even arise against the prince of princes. They both take on and take on God. And he shall be broken without human hand. Antiochus Epiphanes was not broken by another ruler in the world. He was broken without human hand by disease. The Antichrist will also be broken at the second coming of the Lord without human hand. It'll be God's hand. And the vision of the evenings and mornings which was told is true. Gabriel tells them, all this is true. It's going to be true. Therefore, seal up the vision, for it refers to many days in the future. And so here Daniel has had this vision. And you might want to look at verse 27 if you're real eager to have visions from God. Notice the effect that it had upon Daniel. And I, Daniel, fainted dead away, and was sick as a result of it for days. And then afterward I arose and went about the king's business, and I was astonished at the vision, but no one understood it. And so he was completely wiped out for the vision, took some sick leave to recover, and then went back to work. 3 lessons from this chapter. The astounding prophecies of the Lord, as He lays out for mankind dozens and hundreds of years prior to the events, with just the minute detail, the future that He knew was coming. God does something very interesting through Isaiah the prophet. The children of Israel had given themselves to the worship of all of these dumb idols, these wooden idols, these stone idols, these things that couldn't talk. And God got sick of it one day, and He spoke to them, and He said, listen, let's have a God showdown as it relates to this whole thing. What are you doing worshiping these stupid things when you have me to worship? And so He said, let's do a simple test, a simple God test. You know, they have the test on the radio where they have the piercing sound and all of that on TV. And so let's do a little God test. He said, bring out all of your idols, all of your gods, and just kind of pile them up here, put them up, you know. And I remember when I was a kid in elementary school, I had a friend named Curtis Truden. He was a good friend, great guy. He also owned the largest set of World War II plastic army men that we would set up every Saturday in his backyard, and then we would blow them to smithereens with dirt clods. But listen, enough about my childhood. Anyway, so he tells them to bring out all of these things that can't move, just like those little plastic soldiers could, can't move, and put them there. And God says, I'll tell you what, let's do a little test for them. He said, bring these idols forth and have them show us what will happen. Be dismayed and see it all together. Indeed, God said, you're nothing, your work is nothing, and he who chooses you is an abomination. And the passage there is Isaiah chapter 41, verses 21 through 24 for your note takers. God said, I got a simple test for God. It's a minimum requirement for God. He said, if you're going to worship a God, that God ought to be able to tell you the future with 100% accuracy before it happens. And God, of course, passed his own test. Then he said they ought to be able to tell us the former things, how we got here, why we are the way that we are, this kind of thing that is so perfectly described in Genesis 1, 2, and 3, and the creation of man and the fall of man. Then finally God just lowers his standard as it relates to these gods altogether, and he says, I'll tell you what, I can see you guys are having trouble with this test. He says, why don't you just say something? Anybody got anything you want to say here? And they just sat there as dumb and as mute as an idol could possibly be. And the problem is that God knows that we are and will become like our God. And if we follow after worships who can't see and they can't speak and they cannot hear, then we will become spiritually blind and deaf and dumb. But the great thing about becoming like your God when you worship the God that we worship is that we become a little more like him each day. And so there is this tremendous testimony to the divine authorship of this book that prophecy is. One of the things that really bugs me, and it happens every so often, but recently in the letters to the editor someplace, I don't know if it was in Newsweek or it was in the Chronicle or whether it was in the Bee, but we had a couple of them and they run in spurts like this, and someone wrote about blind faith. As Christians, we just live by this blind faith, and I'll tell you, I hate the term blind faith. I don't like it, and I didn't like those letters. If you wrote it, I'm sorry about that. But I don't like that term because God has taken and given us such a testimony to the fact that He has authored this book. And if He has been completely, without exception, 100% trustworthy in every prophecy that He gave that has come to pass, then He is completely trustworthy concerning every prophecy that He said is yet in our future. There's nothing blind about that. By the time one looks at the prophetic element of the Scriptures, it is never an issue of a child of God operating by blind faith. It becomes an issue of blind unbelief. You take the passages concerning Jesus as the Messiah, that He would be born of a virgin, that He would be a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, David, of the tribe of Judah, and that He would be betrayed by a friend. Not only be betrayed by a friend, but He would be betrayed for 30 pieces of silver, that the money would be thrown back, that He would be pierced and His hands pierced, and all of these things as the Scriptures lay out, all of these prophecies concerning Him. And the image that I like is every single prophecy is a stroke of the brush of the master painter giving us a picture of the Messiah who's to come. And by the time you have all of those hundreds of prophecies painted on a page, you stand back and it looks just like the Lord Jesus. We're going to see next week in chapter 9 that no one can fulfill the picture that God has painted of the Messiah, because the one in chapter 9 of Daniel is time sensitive and no one can come on the scene and say they fulfilled it. In other words, if Jesus is not the Messiah, no one's the Messiah. Let's eat, drink, and be merry, tomorrow we die. But He is the Messiah. He is the Messiah. And so our faith, the outstanding thing, the Word of God here as it relates to prophecy. When I became a new Christian, the thing that absolutely hooked me initially was prophecy. And it got me through a lot. When I became a new Christian, and I've mentioned this before, but I've got a couple more minutes. But when I became a new Christian, I had grown up in a household that was a very depressing environment. And I was determined never to be around a depressed person the rest of my life. Or a depressing person, melancholy person. I didn't want to be around them. They could live. It was all right with me that they lived. But they just weren't going to live around me. And I was the life of the party. I wasn't a goon. I wasn't a goof. But I tell you, I just wasn't going to head into that way. And I give my life to the Lord. And when I give my life to the Lord, all of a sudden I'm hit with spiritual warfare. And I don't have any idea what spiritual warfare is even yet. And I'm hit with this incredible melancholy. This kind of depression that hits me. And I remember crying out to God and saying, God, here, before I even knew you, I was never sad, I was never depressed, I was never any these things. Now I come to know you and I got to deal with this. Am I missing something here on this? And then I began to learn about spiritual warfare and what was going on in that whole thing. But the devil thrashed me. He thrashed me like Foghorn Leghorn beat up that dog in every one of those cartoons. He beat me. And he came in 1,000 different ways with this question: hath God really said? Right out of Genesis chapter 3. And he pounded me by trying to cast doubt in my mind upon the Word of God. And he pounded and he pounded and he pounded and he pounded, and he would have moved me if I did not have the more sure word of prophecy that Peter speaks about in his epistles, where he declares concerning the fact that he went up on the Mount of Transfiguration, saw Jesus transfigured in His glory, was there with James and John. The heavens spoke, the Father spoke, this is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased. And Peter said, I do not believe that Jesus is the Messiah based upon the supernatural of that event. He said, I believe that Jesus is the Messiah because of the more sure word of prophecy. His life matched the prophecies of the Old Testament concerning the Messiah, and no one's life can. And so the Word of God, he'd try and move me, but I couldn't get away from the fulfilled prophecies, that prophetic element And it was so important to me. And I realized that if I moved from God, it was a problem with me, and not because God hadn't given me enough to believe in and to put my faith in. And so the prophecies of the Word of God intended to bolster our faith. The second thing that this teaches us is hold the ice. Yeah, we'll bring that in just a minute. The second thing that we learn here is that there's an end coming. There's an end coming to all of this. There's an end coming to this kind of treatment of God's people on planet Earth. And the third thing that we learn here is to just keep working. Isn't it interesting that Daniel, when he recovers from the vision, what does he do? He goes back to work. He goes back to work. Jesus said, occupy till I come. Take care of business till I come. He laid out what it's going to get like, how hard it's going to be, all of the characteristics of the end times, and then, having laid all of that out, he said, you do what I've called you to do all the way till the end. Even when, like Daniel, what you see happening makes you sick, affects you physically, you keep working. It would have been very easy for Daniel to say, what in the world difference does my life make? The whole thing's going to play out this way, and the Jews are going to get slaughtered for how long? He could have taken the whole way and looked at that, but he didn't do that. He recovered from the vision, and then he went back to work. It's God's business, man's history, how and when he brings it to an end. But he calls us to be faithful to what he's called us to do till the end. And it's not our business to decide what difference faithfulness to his call upon my life is, or what difference it's making in the world, or how much good it's doing. We leave that to the Lord. He's called us to be faithful to his call upon our lives and to be watching and waiting for his return. So one of the great applicational lessons of Daniel chapter 8 is, even when what you're seeing happening around you makes you sick, just keep on working, keep serving the Lord until his word is fulfilled.